Welcome again. I'm Dr. Donna Keel of DePaul University, and I personally am just thrilled to be in this space with you tonight. And I want to sincerely thank you for taking an hour out of your time to focus on something so important as equity in our nation and especially in our schools. And we also want to thank the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources program, who is the funder of the grant that we are subcontractors for with the Barra Education Foundation. And sincerely thank Sheila Smith, who is the CEO of Barra, for her belief in equity and in the Library of Congress and primary sources. And so with that gratitude, we're going to begin. And let's begin with, as you can, in the chat, as I'm going through our group norms, if you would please share your name and the school that maybe you're affiliated with, and then one hope you have for today's webinar. We know that an hour of time is precious, and we know that you could be doing lots of things, but you chose to be here with us during this really pivotal time in our nation's history, at a time when it feels like we're turning a page. So please just share your name, your school, and one hope you have for today's webinar. And as we begin today, whenever we gather to do the important work of equity, we want to always establish norms for our interactions with each other. And our other facilitators, Dr. Curry, will add in, as may Felicia. But when we come together today, we want to make sure we allow this space to be a brave space, to bring yourself with an open mind and an open heart, and be as present and fully engaged as you can. Know that we're all learning in this together, and realize that there may be discomfort, and allow that discomfort. And when you're sharing in the chat, which is we welcome you to do that, to use I statements, and to remember that everyone has positive intent. Assume that positive intent and courageously name anything that's troubling you. We also ask that you withhold judgment and own your own intention. And I come to that because as we introduce folks today, I want you to know clearly that I'm not the racial equity expert. The experts are our two key facilitators, Dr. Tina Curry. Dr. Curry is an outstanding equity worker. She is an equity coach, and her research has been along the lines of equity and supporting equity in classroom. And then our other expert is Felicia Severi. And if you scroll through your little Zoom boxes, you'll see Felicia and Tina, and I hope that they're waving to you. Both Tina and Felicia are the true experts today. I come to this space to support them. And joining them also is Dr. David Bates. So David, if you can wave as well. Dr. Bates is a history professor and history expert from Concordia University. And Dr. Bates was also an expert in primary sources from the Library of Congress, having coordinated Library of Congress TPS program in the past. As I mentioned, I'm Dr. Keel from DePaul, and my expertise is really in education and educational leadership. And more importantly, those of you who know me, it's around human emotion and the way that emotion impacts the decisions that we make. And in particular, my research has focused for the last few years in empathy and the power of empathy. So with that, I want to start us with some inspiration. And what you see on your screen right now is a bit of a snippet of the poet laureate Amanda Gorman's words that she shared yesterday. So if you take a really nice deep breath in right now and release that deep breath, let's all take a moment just to be inspired by Amanda's words.
The shade of flame and unafraid, the new dawn blooms as we free it. For there is always light if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it.
We ask today that we're all brave enough to be it, and brave enough to see it, and see it as we go through a really pivotal program with the Library of Congress, because we're at that moment where history is being made almost every day. What we saw yesterday was a promise of hope. And what we saw a couple of weeks ago was what happens in a country, especially in a democracy. And so we're going to talk about past and present. And I want to ground us first with talking about why we call this program RISE and why it's within the Library of Congress. And so I'm going to shift it over to my colleague, Dr. Bates. Dave?
Hi, good evening, everybody, and thanks so much for being here. As a historian, it's always very easy for me to talk about why history is so significant, but I think this program is a really special distillation of that. And, I love history. I think it's fascinating, but the value of history is not in learning cool stuff. It's in teaching us why we are where we are today and how we got here and hopefully how we can change tomorrow. So just a few quick things here on the program we're running here. Examining history, we feel, is vital to creating positive change. Like I said, you can't understand where we're going next or where we are now without understanding where we've been before. And then two big drivers of this program through the Library of Congress and BARA are about primary sources. So we'll talk a little bit about primary sources later and do some analysis, but we believe that primary sources, these original documents, are the possessors of the key information that we need. They give you the context of what's going on in the past. They give you a direct link to the past. And because of the fact that they are sources from the time period, firsthand accounts, they're able to promote inquiry, empathy, and critical thinking in ways that other sources really cannot. So that's really our focus here, and that's our hope.
So when we were developing RISE, we had three goals in mind. The first one is twofold. We wanted to grow impact. And the second part is that we wanted to dismantle racism, but using the Library of Congress primary sources as a tool and an aid to do that. The second one is to increase self-awareness, and in increasing self-awareness, come to understand the historic causes of racism. And the last goal, which is the one that we believe holds the real true power to change and transformation, is to increase empathy to dismantle racism. And now Donna will share the structure for this webinar.
So if you notice on your screen, there is a picture that's pretty evocative of racism. If at any point you have reactions to the Library of Congress primary sources that you'll see as images on the screen, that's well intended, and we encourage you to put in the chat what you're seeing, what you're thinking, and what you're wondering about, as David will model for you later. But we know that by looking at primary sources and by using some systematic methods that we can really help deepen our understanding of racism and our own equity work. So today's webinar is a very concrete, straightforward structure where we're going to do a 5-minute welcome activity that's going to follow in just a second. We're going to give you some research around equity and around racial equity in education, and do that for about 10 minutes. And then we want to actually give you an exercise. So we want to model for you a RISE exercise that you can use either with your K-12 students, or if you are an academic leader, you can use this with adults. And so we ask you to look at this through two lenses, through the lens of both a participant in that modeling exercise, but also as a potential trainer of racial equity. And so let's get ready for the welcome activity. And those of you who got on a little bit ago, you know that in the chat is an actual journal where you can do this activity on your own screen if you wanted to. I think it'd be a little hard to print it out at this point, but if in case you want to use these with your faculty, you'll see everything that we're doing in a journal format so that you could write it out if you choose to. What we know about race and equity is that racism and our view of that always begins with identity. The research shows us that it's important as we look at equity to start with who we are. We can't shift anything until we're really clear on our own identity and what that identity means to us. So you have, and you'll see on the screen, there's a circle with 4 circles extending from it. We're going to do a who are you exercise. In the center of a circle, and if you have a piece of paper next to you and a pencil, you could do it on that as well, put your name in that circle. And then in the circles that surround it, the 4 circles that surround it, put those descriptors of who you are. So for me, it might be professor, it might be yoga enthusiast, it might be dog mom. For you, it's something different. Tina, what are yours?
Can you go back to it so I can see it?
Yes, you can.
Okay, there we are. So for some reason, I always include the color of my skin as one of my descriptors. And then I also include like my role as a mother. It's a really, really big part of who I am and how I show up. And maybe I would say one more that constantly comes up whenever I've been asked to do this is something regarding my faith.
Thank you so much. So we planted that because I've done this exercise with lots of white teachers and with African-American and brown teachers as well. And what's typically striking to me is that our white teachers typically don't put skin color or race as one of our identifiers. So I myself typically would put mom, educator, runner, grandmother, but I typically wouldn't put white. It's not one of those first things that I go to. But for African-American or our Latinx folks or Asian folks, they tend to gravitate towards those descriptors that are of race. And we're going to share with you as we go along the research around why that's so significant. But as you think about and you look at your circles right now, and I encourage you to please put in the chat what your descriptors might be. It's a great way for us to get to know each other, but to put your name and maybe your 4 descriptors. As you think about those 4 descriptors that you have, think about, and I'm actually going to go back so we're not distracted. Think about a time when one of those 4 descriptors made you especially proud, where you felt deeply, I love this moment. So for me, as a mom, I remember feeling incredible pride when I got to be on stage with my daughter getting her MBA and being able to hand her that diploma. It was a moment that I will forever cherish. Think about one of your descriptors that really made you feel proud. After you do that, what I'd like you to do is think about one of your descriptors that made you feel extremely ashamed or made you feel unwelcome. And I think Felicia was going to share with us one of her descriptors that has been difficult for her. Felicia?
Okay, one of my descriptors that have made me feel, I would say, oh boy, I don't know why this happens, folks, but I go like blank. I have tons of things to say. One of my descriptors recently is being Black. And I have participated often in events and workshops and programs where I was the only Black person there. And, but it's made me feel really uncomfortable. And when I think about myself, I just think, I see myself as a person, but there are times where it does make me feel truly uncomfortable to know that I am, or others may be seeing me as different than, what they see as other Blacks. And it's been really challenging for me. And I have worked with Dr. Hill, and we've talked about it, but it's one of those it's being Black and having others think that I behave differently than the others.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Felicia, for your openness. And as those of you share in the chat, please know that Felicia and Tina will be responding in the chat as our equity experts. When I think if I put white as a descriptor for myself, there are certainly times most recently that it's been difficult to be white and that I've associated with it and thought it was not a thing I was proud to be, and yet it's not something you can change. As you think about the descriptors too, especially the ones that you're proud of, I want you to think about a stereotype associated with one of the groups which you identify with. For example, if by chance you put in, I'm a Catholic, but I'm not a radical right-wing Republican. The sentence that you might fill in is, I'm a Christian, but I'm not a radical Republican. When I think of, there's an easy one for me, I'm a professor, but I'm not a nerd. Now, everybody I know would actually disagree with that. But I try to make sure that I'm not a nerd, but I tend to be that person in the room who says, you know what the research says? So there are those things that we believe about ourselves that we're really filled with pride, but there's a stereotype also on the other side that makes us be uncomfortable about who we are. So what we want to do is really look clearly at identity and how research forms the association with racism and our identity, and then to look at what actually racism is. And those of you who joined us for the first RISE webinar in December know we explored racism, but Dr. Bates is going to kind of take us through a little review of what is racism and how it really relates to the work that we'll do together today, which we intend to be very practical for you. Dave?
So in thinking about what racism is, as Dr. Keel mentioned, if you were here for our first webinar, we talked in pretty good detail about what race is. And so just a quick review of that is, race is just the idea that there are, that the idea that humanity can be separated into different groups based on sort of physical or phenotypic differences. And so race, as we know, is a social construct. That's the term that we all know, right? And I think the thing that's most important when we talk about racism is that just because race is not something that's scientifically real, that doesn't mean it's not socially real. It's obviously something that has an enormous impact on people's lives day to day, even though it is just a social construct, right? It's something that really impacts people. So racism is essentially belief in a hierarchy of races, right? That there are certain people who, via these social constructs, are deservedly above or below others. And one of the issues with racism is how malleable it can be. Because race is a social construct, racism is very difficult to pin down, right? So at various times, racism can come in the form of claiming that a certain group is incompetent, right? And kind of pitiable, or sly and devious, or violent and dangerous. And so it's this sort of malleability that makes it really difficult to confront directly. So the reasons why racism happens, at the heart of racism is the process of dehumanization. So it is making a group of people into the other, right? To make them oppressible, for lack of a better term. And so the research on this suggests that the formation of something that's called an enemy image is central to this. The psychological process of demonizing a person or group of people, making them seem less than human, and most importantly, making them seem less worthy of humane treatment. And the research on this is actually very disturbing in that as you engage in this process of the enemy image and dehumanization, you are not only solidifying that idea in your own mind, but you also have actual cognitive changes that you undergo, that people lose the ability to listen and communicate and practice empathy. And so if you go back one slide real quick, just an example of this from the 20th century. So this is a newspaper from 1942 from Oakland, California. And I think something that's really interesting about this is that the slur, the racial slur, is actually used in two different places here. So it's used to refer in the main headline to Japanese Americans that are going to be interned and imprisoned for the duration of the war. And then below on the right, you see another headline using the same racial slur, which is referring to a different group of people, which is the Japanese army in Java. But it's a good clue into the way that Japanese Americans were already being dehumanized and being connected as an enemy group, even within the US. So the effect of this kind of dehumanization process is all of the, the horrific acts that we're familiar with from history. So violence, war crimes, all the way up to genocide. And so once we see people as being the other, right, as being the other side of a conflict that we're in, the conflict becomes good versus evil, and that justifies essentially anything. And so to keep with this example of Japanese American internment, this is a very stark photo of the order telling Japanese Americans that they needed to register with local authorities so that they could be issued a number and essentially prepare to be deported and imprisoned for years. And I think one thing that's kind of interesting about this is the general, John DeWitt, who is in charge of this process, said the following: "In the war in which we are now engaged, racial affinities are not severed by migration. The Japanese race is an enemy race, and while many second and third generation Japanese born on American soil possess American citizenship and have become quote unquote Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted." So a really powerful and disturbing example of how creating someone as an enemy would create space in the mind to say that someone who is born in America and has American citizenship is somehow not American, is the enemy simply because of their race. So there's all sorts of research too backing up the idea of empathy, or the lack thereof, which is one of the core principles of RISE in the way that we're trying to confront all of this. So many of you are probably familiar with the research of Kenneth and Mamie Clark, who conducted a series of experiments in which they essentially presented Black children with dolls, white and black dolls, and asked them to choose which one was smarter or prettier or better behaved, which one they'd want to take home. And the heartbreaking result is the idea that in most cases, the Black children chose the white doll. And it was used actually in the Brown versus Board case and as an example of how segregation and racism more generally can cause actual cognitive and emotional changes, even in children, and can be internalized by people. And so Clark's research, if you take it beyond just the doll experiment and think about his body of work, what he really centered on toward the end was empathy. The idea that empathy, as being separate from sentimentality or pity or sympathy, is just acknowledging the underlying similarity and unity of the human condition and creating a sense of mutual respect that can reach across racial lines. And so one thing that I think we have to think about and consider too when we're thinking about this historically is the way in which empathy is far too often a one-way street, that the oppressed is often forced to feel empathy for the oppressor, but not the other way around. And so one of the things we're trying to achieve with RISE is using primary sources and using research and theory to understand how we can activate empathy in ourselves for others, regardless of what position of privilege we might be in.
So one of the, it was Dr. Clark's research that was really pivotal in my own career of reading his decade-long study of the power of racism, especially for Black children, in how it really manifested in their achievement in the classroom. But moreover, the great news about empathy, and Clark was really informed by great psychologists of Alfred Adler, as well as Fritz Perls, in looking at the power of empathy and how empathy can transform a child's life and a teacher's life. Here's the good news. Empathy is a skill that we can learn. And empathy is something that we can train our students to every day and train ourselves to get deeper. And as David said, there's a big difference between empathy and sympathy, as well as compassion. So what RISE really does, and what we're going to model for you, is how we've integrated the building of empathy throughout this lesson that you can do with your students or with your faculty, and how you can use these primary sources to really engage students at a new level that allows them to have the safety we need in order to really unpack our own racism, but also have the reality of history. So I'd ask you in the chat as we're transitioning, when you look at the face of this little African-American boy who obviously is selecting a white doll, what do you see? What feelings do you see? What do you think he's feeling? Just as a prelude to our exercise, just please put in the chat. And what we know about empathy, where it starts, is with something called mirror neurons. And we'll talk about this more in future RISE sessions, but it's the mirror neurons in our brain, which were only discovered in 1992, which allow us to look in the eyes of another and to feel what they feel. And it's a human reality that we're born that way, that we want to feel what other people feel. So what we're going to do for you now is model for you this exercise. So as I mentioned, as we began, we wanted to give you some research, some context, and a bit of an opening. And now we want to do some modeling of the exercise, and Tina's going to take us through.
So this is just an overview of the lesson or experience. So the purpose of this experience is to do three things. The first is just to create space for you to explore your identity, your feelings, your belief, actions, like all these things that are related to racial equity. And to be able to discuss who you are by examining the Library of Congress primary sources. I have some experience with this. I had to go through this in preparation for this work with you, and discovering who I was and being able to discuss who I am was so powerful. And the Library of Congress primary sources served as such an amazing tool to help me to do that. And the last one is to build skills of cognitive empathy for others, also using the Library of Congress primary sources. That whole thing around perspective making is going to be so important for those of you who are taking your equity journey.
Yeah, and let me just add a comment that's in the chat about the little boy potentially trying to please the researcher by choosing the white doll. It's really interesting because Kenneth Clark and his wife are African-American. And so they were intentionally tried to ensure that that wouldn't happen, although culturally it did happen. So you're absolutely right on target. It's the reality of wanting to please because white is far more acceptable. And rather than what they discovered was it wasn't who was the researcher was guiding it, but that white was conditioned from an early age as the acceptable and more beautiful of the norm. There are great, if you ever want more deeper dive into this research, there are great YouTube video on it as well. So Tina, want to take us through the bell ringer?
Sure, I'll take you through the bell ringer. Okay, so before you begin any lesson around inequity, racism, or any system of oppression, it is so important that individuals have a space and opportunity to express their feelings. And it's important for those individuals to know that all of their feelings are welcome, that all of their feelings are valid. And using the primary sources are a really great way to like open our hearts to understand those feelings that people bring to this space. But before you can even do any of that work, it is so important to establish norms. Going back to what I said earlier, norms are so important, Donna. Norms are so important for just helping us to deal with our emotions in a way where we can still learn and we can grow and continue to develop. So establishing norms, there are three things that you want to have at the center of it is what is acceptable? What does the community feel is acceptable? What is not acceptable? And this has to be done so that everyone in the community can be okay, that they can feel protected. And why are we creating the norms? People need to know why norms exist. Like there are ways that we agree to behave in this space. And so we encourage you in doing this work that you create norms before even attempting to start it.
You also, if we go back to that opening exercise, I encourage you in the chat right now, as we start to talk more deeply about racism and inequity, what are the feelings that you're having? You know, what does it stir in for you? And I know whenever I do this work, I just automatically always feel anxious. I worry. I don't want to misstep. I also get very passionate and feel angry at times at the injustice that we have to have the work. But if you can share in the chat the three feelings that you have, knowing that tonight you were going to spend an hour talking about racism and inequity and how to actually instill anti-racism into your classes or into your school. If you could just share those three feelings, it would be great for us to have a sense and a read. And so Dave is going to take us through, as he's the primary source expert and the historian, what the Library of Congress offers and give us that first experience that, again, you can do this with your students or with your faculty.
So the image that I've selected here, I'm actually going to put the link in the chat here. And I hope that comes through. Let me just check.
You got it.
So this is an image that was widely circulated in the South. So this is an image of Martin Luther King, and the headline obviously here says Martin Luther King at Communist Training School. And so what I'd like to do in sort of discussing this source is walk through the Library of Congress process. So if you could actually jump ahead one slide just for a second. So we're basing it on this. This is the primary source analysis tool from the Library of Congress. And the three steps that they recommend for students are observe, reflect, and question. So if we go back to the source itself, and I will put that link in the chat again in case anybody missed it, just because it's hard to see the text underneath if you're looking at it just on the slide. The way that we're operationalizing these questions are, what do you see, what do you think, and what do you wonder about? So what I want to do is just give you a chance to think about this for a second. So, take a minute. No need to rush. You can check the link yourself if you wanted to zoom in a little more and look at the text below. If you're looking for a tip, because I don't know if we have time to read all of that text, you really want to skip down to the bottom. That last paragraph is really where the energy is at, the last couple of lines. And I could just say them. The four horsemen of racial agitation have brought tension, disturbance, strife, and violence in their advancement of the communist doctrine of racial nationalism. So that gives you kind of a flavor for this. So with that in mind, What are some things you see? What are some things you think? And what are some things you wonder about? And so you can type some stuff into the chat here. What I'd ask is just that you can do this kind of in any order. It doesn't have to be 1, 2, 3. But if you're going to type something in, just give me a sense of if it's a C, a think, or a wonder. So you can put an S, a T, or a W at the beginning. And then we can hopefully get some discussion going about the source and maybe what it means and how we can use it. Yeah, so some good questions. And you can already see how the process works, right? That sometimes people are going to start with wonder and sometimes people start with think. And so you don't necessarily want to kind of bind your students and say, you have to start with observe. You can kind of jump in. So a few good questions here. Why communism? Who is the audience of the newspaper? That's always an excellent question to ask with any source. Someone thinking shocked that this is a ridiculous image. Wondering and marveling at MLK's courage. Who's the newspaper? Who's controlling the narrative? Excellent question. What's the agenda? Yep. What is he jotting down? What's the purpose? So excellent job, kind of breaking this down. I'll give you a little bit more of an insight into this in a little bit. But this is the basic Library of Congress process that you can do with your students. You can really apply this to any source. It doesn't have to be an image. It can be a written text. You can break it down in chunks if you want, right? If you wanted to focus on specific parts, you could. But you could easily apply this to any source that you find and use in your classroom.
And you can use it with adults as well. So those of you who are principals or assistant principals on the call, having adults go through this is really significant, especially when you think about many of our current teachers may not have really explored civics or may not have explored current events in their own training, their own high school or their own college experience. I mean, the reality of Martin Luther King being accused of being a communist is a new reality that unless you're a historian, you may not be very comfortable, very aware of. And here again is the tool.
Can I say just 2 more quick things? One is just, I wanted to point out, someone in the chat said that there's a through line from communist to BLM. So that's a phenomenal connection to make here. The way that words and names specifically get used publicly to smear social justice movements, that this is not a new thing when you hear BLM or Antifa is in charge of every bad thing that happens in the country, right? That's not new. That for a long time it was communism, and we can't have any progress in civil rights because that's communist, and Martin Luther King is a communist, right? So the use of words and names, and a few people asked this in the chat, who is controlling the message? Who is naming is such a vital question. But the other thing I would say, just as a 30,000 foot view, one thing I always like to say is that secondary sources give you a sentence, right? Primary sources give you a question. And I think you can see that here, that you could read a paragraph in a textbook that says King was regularly smeared by his opponents as a communist, right? That white supremacists in the South used the term communist to smear him. And that's fine because that's certainly true. But I think you get so much more when you're looking at a source, because now look at all the big questions we're asking about who controls messaging, who's in charge of this, where did this come from, things like that. So the other analysis tool that we actually have developed, which is aligned with the RISE analysis guide, which you all have access to. The way that we kind of break this down is that the tool we just saw, the observe reflect question, is a way of breaking down the source and understanding where the source comes from and what the source might mean. The analysis guide that we've developed is more about you. It's about reflecting on your own reaction to the source, about your position in society, maybe your privilege, right? What your emotional reactions are, and interrogating those in a bit of a deeper way. And so this is really valuable too if, again, our interest here is not just understanding sources, it's using sources to move forward, right, and create an anti-racist pedagogy. And so if we move ahead with the parts of the RISE analysis guide and apply them to this source here, So if we're thinking about reflection, right, which is one of our key components here, we can easily apply any of these questions to this source. So what do you feel? What do you believe? And what actions in your life may have prompted those? So take a quick second and reflect on that. So what does this source make you feel? What does seeing that big blaring headline in that photo make you feel? What do you believe? So this is an excellent source for that question. Do you believe this is true? Why or why not? And so where does this come from in your life? What are your experiences and your beliefs and your knowledge?
And those of you who are leaders in your school, you can see how really unpacking, how someone feels and believes and what happened in your life really takes you with your faculty at a deeper level as to why some things might be surfacing in their interactions with students, and helps us to really unpack and get in touch with who we are so that we can use history in a powerful way to help bridge that divide of inequity.
And you know what? I'll have to say this. Dave, when you first put this, when we were going through what we were going to share with the participants, when I first saw that, I have to tell you, there was a wonder. I did. I wondered, really? They said he was communist. As with so many other people that I'm finding out about, like when I hear about things that supposedly Malcolm X or Sam Cooke even, and I'm like, really? And when I saw this, I did wonder. And that's why I put something in the chat just asking, am I the only one who actually wondered because of all of the propaganda and the way they slander people? So I was just curious, anybody else feel that way? Or did everyone else just immediately not believe it?
Which is an important, and Tina has a great, thank you for the great question, Felicia. And Tina's question about, really with your students, don't skip the feel part. Really exploring feelings with students is the first pathway to empathy. And I think Dave's going to take us through the next part of RISE. And if you notice, RISE is following the acronym, so it's easy for a classroom teacher to remember that you do reflection, inquiry, self-awareness, and empathy. And again, much like the primary source analysis tool, they don't have to go in an order. It's just easier to remember the acronym RISE, but you don't have to start with just reflection or start with inquiry. You can move around, especially when you have very poignant images from primary sources.
Yeah, absolutely. And Felicia, Felicia's more of an expert than I am in this area of sort of empathy and building this kind of work. And it's such a great question. And I think one thing that's vital there is, and I want to piggyback on something Tina said in the chat as well. The feeling part here is not extra, right? The part about interrogating your emotions and the affective side here, as opposed to the cognitive side, that's not a sideshow, right? And I think Tina made a great point, which is you may very well want to do this part first. You may want to interrogate the emotions, especially if it's a source that's really inflammatory or difficult or has some difficult subject matter. If you're dealing with racism, those sources can be very, very triggering for students, right? And really cause them some pain and trauma. And so you can absolutely, try the emotional part first and work through some of the emotions and the reflections and the self-awareness first before you start just treating it as this kind of clinical, breaking down a source kind of process. I think that's a great point. And in allowing space for what Felicia said, to allow people to wonder without having any sort of guilt or judgment, right? Like wonder that this could have happened and wonder what's true and what's not, et cetera. Yeah, I think that's so vital.
And there's another great comment in the chat that deserves some focus, which Victoria talks about Molly feeling frightened and wondering if privilege allows you the advantage of not being frightened. And I would say that is such a deep insight and such a significant kind of awareness that those of us who are white, need to really realize, especially if we have our African-American or brown students look at a picture and they do feel frightened. Why don't we feel frightened? Is that privilege? Is that white, is that our own supremacy saying, well, I don't have to worry? I wouldn't be accused of being a communist, or we are detached enough. And that's where empathy is so key, because it's Molly being able to say she's frightened and Victoria being able to say, I'm not, why? Why aren't I? And being able to connect with the other. So let's go through the inquiry section.
So in the inquiry section, you're really zeroing in on, you're fusing some of the work here from the Library of Congress tool and some of your own feelings about what do you think people in the source believed, right? So trying to build some empathetic inquiry. And I don't want to put her on the spot, but I think Felicia probably has more insight into this process than I would, but kind of being empathetic in the way that you're inquiring into the source and your experience with it and others' experiences with it.
So I hope that my computer is going in and out, but with the inquiry, it's like, what do you think those in the picture believed? You know, with inquiry, oftentimes it's, well, not oftentimes, it generally is just you going within and asking yourself questions about what you're seeing, what you're thinking, what you're feeling, right? And so if you're looking out at someone else, and if there's an emotion that's coming up for you about whatever is happening with that individual group of people or individual, it's like you will find yourself at times feeling an emotion, and it's important to be able to turn that around and to ask yourself, why am I feeling this? Where's this coming from? Where is, how did it get there? If I'm feeling an emotion that is more negative or judgmental, inquiry and empathy are just so huge, I believe, in the, you know, with what we're doing today, because if we could just take the time to just pause and just reflect on our own selves, I think it will guide us to better understanding and putting ourselves in the, or not that we could ever put ourselves in the shoes of another, but to be able to at least have some empathy for what they may be going through.
So great, Felicia. And I think Dave is going to go through the self-awareness piece. And there's a comment in the chat from, oops, I missed it, the name, from Brigitte of Marist about, you know, making sure when you do something like this with students to give them time for self-care, which flows with self-awareness. So Dave?
Yeah, I saw that comment too. I think that's such a terrific fusing of the different things we're trying to do with practice in the classroom. So I think that, you know, the goal here is trying to get to an understanding of sources cognitively, right? Understanding this source that we're doing here and who created it and the time period, but also the feelings that it elicited from people then and the feelings it might elicit now in the current time period and what that might mean. And so I think that's significant too.
But he looks so cute.
And so the self-awareness piece is really, you have to pull yourself in, right? And so I think, and again, I don't want to overstep here, and Felicia jump in at any time, but I think this is the part that is the riskiest part personally. It's the part where you really have to invest yourself in this and to really commit to saying, for example, have you ever experienced the same feelings as those in the picture? And this could be either way, right? Have you ever been accused of being something that you're not because someone wanted to degrade you? Have you ever accused someone else? That's a very risky process for students and for adults.
Very powerful, Dave. Very, very powerful, because oftentimes when you're white, and what I've come across or what I've found here lately is there's a major struggle, especially with even the, you know, my white colleagues that are here in Washington, and they struggle with being able to face themselves, you know. It's like if I bring up for example, if I even say the word white privilege, you know, I can say you are privileged, and there is this, you could feel the energy just automatically shifts and the defensiveness goes up, and I'm thinking, okay, you're not even willing, if you're not even willing to even listen and to hear and to watch, how do you begin to take off the armor that you're wearing, right? So, but no, I agree.
And self-awareness, like empathy, is a skill you can teach. I mean, and those of you who are in the social emotional learning space, know that self-awareness and self-management are key to social emotional learning. But self-awareness builds by practice. It's like any kind of skill set. By having the questions that we're saying here and then developing your own and using something like a primary source, you can help students to get into the habit of self-awareness, of asking themselves that question. You know, have you experienced those same feelings? What do you wish would be different? Remember, one of the goals, especially for us in RISE, but I think of all of us who are teachers, is to create students who become very responsible citizens, who want to go out and make a difference in the world, who believe in civic action, who believe in the power of helping and of service. And so when we look at equity, we look at models of whether it's Martin Luther King or others of service, and the way to get to service is through self-awareness. And so we know that spending that time in self-awareness is incredibly important for your students. And it leads to the final skill, which is not the final, but is embedded throughout, which is empathy. And as I said, I've spent years studying empathy and looking at the power of empathy. And as a former principal, when I was principal of a very richly diverse school, what I found in my own experience, especially with my African-American and Latinx students, is that when teachers could be empathic for students, which does not mean lenient, does not mean complacent, does not mean easy, but when there's empathy, those students that I had accelerated, they soared, they went beyond thriving. For me as a principal and as a teacher, empathy was that power to be able to tap into students and then to find their genius and to be able to truly challenge them with rigor and relevance because I could feel where they were coming from. But to get there, you first have to do exactly what Felicia said, is to be able to put down those barriers of culture that make you presume that if a student doesn't do work, they're lazy, or if a student can't read as quickly as another, it's because of the color of their skin. It's empathy that allows you to feel what the student is feeling or feel what your faculty member is feeling and grow that. So in my research around empathy, the key factor for me in helping teachers to grow empathy and helping others to grow empathy is knowing that there are 3 kinds of empathy. And in the chat, if you would, all of you, write down if you are, share with us, if you are empathic, if you know you're empathic, how do you know you are? How do you know that you really can give empathy to someone? And why do you personally think, if you do, that empathy is important to racial equity? Because we know that the 3 levels of empathy are first cognitive empathy, then emotional empathy, and then compassionate empathy. So here's how it happens in practice. Cognitive empathy is Dave stubs his toe, and I look at the look on his face and I think, oh, that must hurt. I've been hurt. Yeah, I get it. That hurts. So I think it cognitively. I'm detached. I'm not feeling the pain he's feeling. I am empathizing with him at a cognitive level. If you notice, I'm also not reaching out to him to help him because he stubbed his toe. If we go to emotional empathy, a great example of emotional empathy, which is beyond just thinking, is that when I look in Tina's eyes, and I can remember looking into her eyes on Zoom after the murders of George Floyd and seeing the pain and the tired and the weariness, and I could feel it with her, where her tears moved me to tears because I felt pain, not that kind of pain, because I am not a Black woman, but I could feel her depth of pain. I then moved towards her. You're moving, these levels of empathy move you closer and closer to heart connections. The level of compassionate empathy, which is our ultimate goal with our students, with our own lives, and with our faculty, if you're a leader, is that level of empathy that compels you to action. So for me, seeing the pain of someone like Felicia or Tina or other friends around inequity, or seeing it in my own students, seeing it when they would come to my office as principal, drove me to work on my own anti-racist actions, which are constantly in progress, and I'm working on it every day. Definitely am not there, but it's that action where you think, I have to do something. There's something that I must do because this pain cannot exist without my helping to alleviate it. So it's that level of suffering where you feel compelled to do whatever you can. It's compassionate empathy that drives us to civic action. It's compassionate empathy about a cause, about a person, about a situation. And so in RISE, what we hope to do is, through the process of using primary sources, is to build that compassionate empathy. And so if we look to this exact same example, and we use the tools of empathy of our RISE analysis guide, what we're now looking at is really, how do you believe that those folks felt in the picture? What was going on? What suffering or feelings of others do you want to change? So we're shifting now from from that self-awareness to really, let me look at, if you look at and I would encourage you in the chat, using the questions that you see, as you look at that picture of Martin Luther King and those other gentlemen, what do you really believe? How does that primary source confirm or change what you believe? So I believe in the dignity of all humans. Does this primary source confirm that? Or does it really change it? To me, it moves me towards action. And what's the suffering or feelings that I want to change? I don't want anybody to feel like they don't belong. This is for me personally, but there are feelings that you're having that you want to be compelled to action. And then the last question in empathy is, how can you help? How can you be the help that would change the impact of history? How can you change something that's happening currently? And so if you look, here are the questions from the RISE analysis tool around empathy. Then what we can do too, what we've provided for you, is how to go deeper with your students. And so we've given you a few questions to go deeper when they can look about, questions about what's right and wrong and fairness and injustice. When you look at a picture, this is Ruby Bridges, by the way. If you know the story of Ruby Bridges, what a courageous young woman, who's a courageous, mature woman now. But what questions do you want to explore when you look at a primary source like this? What is it that you want to do? And then I think as we close today, Tina was going to share with you a way that she does this with her own students through a Genius project, through finding what they're passionate about.
Yes, I just want to just quickly share something I've tried in my classroom, Genius Hour Project, which is actually something I learned from a presentation that Donna did at my school, and remote learning sort of forced me to try my hand at it. And what I discovered about my students is that they really want to be a light in the world. Like, they want to end hunger. They were passionate about ending the income wealth inequality gap. They were passionate about girls of color loving themselves. It was just so amazing. And now as I think about it and reflect, I saw them like show so much love for each other and wanted to take like harm and hurt away from other people. And so I think the best way I can like describe like their empathy that they illustrated through this project is that I see my students now as like stewards of other people, if that makes any sense.
It's so beautiful, Tina. And I think, in the chat, if you have stories of empathy, please share those, and then we will definitely share them out. And we'll also send you the recording of this RISE session, as well as the text from the chat. Someone, I think it's Craig, hi Craig, had said tough love can be empathy. Empathy is not really being, all nice and giving in. Empathy can be always boundary setting. And actually, those folks who have the strongest empathy and the deepest compassion also have the greatest boundaries of being able to hold students accountable with compassionate empathy. The one key that I want to mention, which someone alluded to earlier in the chat, is the importance of self-care, self-compassion in order to be empathic. We cannot be empathic if we are disconnected from ourselves. And one way to connect with yourself on your own is to use that tool of reflection. And so what you see up on your screen right now are 4 of the primary sources that we've used in this webinar. As you look at those primary sources, what we'd ask you to do in the chat is just share which one speaks to you the most. And you can we'll number them 1, 2, 3, and 4, with 1 being in the upper left, 2 being in the upper right, 3 being in the lower left, and 4 being in the lower right. Which one of those images truly strikes something in you and resonates with you? Which one moves you to want to do something? And what is it that you want to do? So we began today with what you hoped for out of this webinar. And so what we had hoped for, our hope, was that this webinar would be a call to action to do all the work you can for empathy and equity in your schools and in your own personal life. The questions that we share with RISE, you can use with your family, looking at an image or looking at what's happening in the media or at any time. Knowing what you believe in, what you feel, and what actions are associated helps us to unpack those things more deeply. And Tina, did you have a call to action that you wanted to share at the end, as we end?
You know what? I just want to encourage everyone just to be brave. Wake up in the morning and just say to yourself, what is going to be my bold action today? And if you can just find a place where you can just be brave, I think you're going to be okay. And I think the most important thing that I want to say, I want to use this platform to say, become active allies. Like, there are behaviors where, allies never have to say, I'll never say to Donna, I'm an ally. She's never had to say to me, Tina, I'm an ally. She's an ally through her behavior, because so let's become active allies.
Yeah, and if I could just add a little bit to that, it doesn't have to be anything grandiose, right? It's not like you have to go and you have to march with a sign or anything like that, but just being aware of how you're showing up, being aware of when you're walking through a park or walking down the street, if there's someone that needs some assistance and maybe they don't look like you, maybe they don't talk like you, if they need the assistance, help them. Just step outside of your comfort zone and just be human.
Thanks so much, Felicia. And, in the chat, it looks like so many of you are truly struck by number 4, the image of the boys in the picture, who are obviously angry and striking out against someone who is of a different race than they are. And, going back to what David shared with us about racism, it's a social construct. And so what they're learning is from what's around them. And what we know of the power of education is, each of you who are an educator, a teacher, a principal, a curriculum person, you have the power to change that dynamic. You have the power through helping students to grow empathy, growing their own self-awareness, and growing who they are as really reflective, inquiring minds, to look at the world differently. It only takes a little bit of awareness. And so I encourage you, again, try this with your classes, try it with your faculty. We have a plethora of primary sources that we've gathered from the Library of Congress, where Dave has given short synopses of the historical moment that we'll share with you. We ask you also, if you're really interested in taking a deeper dive, to register, if you haven't already, for the micro-credential, which will give you a digital badge as a expert in racial equity using Library of Congress. It's a great way for you to promote whom you are as an active anti-racist ally. It's also a great way to be able to open the conversation with someone. So if you haven't registered for that micro-credential, again, it's sponsored by the Library of Congress and the Barra Education Foundation. Please feel free to do so, as the registration link was in your email about this webinar. We will have another webinar in February where we'll take a deeper dive into empathy again and the RISE platform, and give you some additional experiences that you can take back to the classroom, as well as take back to your faculty if you happen to be a leader. Team, anything you want to say in closing?
Thank you all so much for spending an hour with us. I have really enjoyed being in community with you.
Yeah, thank you all for coming, and have fun with it. Have fun with it. You're gonna do a great job. You are. We can't go backwards. We can only go forward from here.
Felicia, one of the many reasons I love you. So I want to thank the team. I want to thank Dr. Curry and Felicia and Dr. Bates. And we especially all collectively wanted to thank Sheila Smith and the Barra Education Foundation for tonight. So we ended exactly on time. I'm very proud of us. We were worried that we wouldn't do that. We hope you can join us again. And if you need anything else, please, you know how to reach out to us, and we're happy to be on this equity journey with you. Thank you, folks.
Bye.